Chapter 12 I Do New Friends. Because of Charles's status as a public figure, as well as the future son-in-law of the well-connected Dwight Morrow, some of the richest men in America welcomed him into their homes. Often, after a sumptuous dinner, he would join his new friends in their leather-lined smoking rooms or book-lined libraries. There would be scientists, executives, ambassadors, bankers, politicians, high-ranking officers, publishers, and industrialists, almost exclusively men of capital, and almost exclusively Republicans. If Charles didn't agree with all their conservative opinions, he found he shared many of them. Like these men, he worried about the behavior of the nation's youth, odd considering he was still in his 20s. He was concerned about crime and corruption, as well as the decline of American morals, and he heartily agreed with the measures they proposed to preserve the financial status quo. After all, Charles was a man of capital too. First, there were the lucrative contracts he'd negotiated after the transatlantic flight with both Transcontinental Air Transport and Pan American Airways. Then there were the six-figure royalty checks he received from We, which had earned him $190,000 in just its first 2 months, about $2.6 million today. A year later, it remained on the bestseller list. And then, of course, there was the money from his stocks. As a favored client of the banking empire, J.P. Morgan and Company, of which Dwight Morrow had once been a partner, Charles had the opportunity to purchase blue-chip stocks at discount rates. After buying them at a third of the price quoted on the New York Stock Exchange, he turned around and resold them at the market price. In this way, Charles made a small fortune. By the age of 26, he had enough of a nest egg never to have to worry about money again. He reveled in the company of his new and powerful friends. He found them a far better class of people than the grease monkey mechanics and foul-mouthed barnstormers he knew. And so, as he'd done after graduating from Army Flight School, he broke off his old social life cleanly and began fresh. People from his early days of piloting were mostly forgotten. Even Donald Hall, who'd played such a pivotal role in the creation of the Spirit of St. Louis, was jettisoned. Charles was now a full-fledged member of what his father had called the Money Trust. Hush, hush, wedding. On February 12th, 1929, Dwight Morrow called reporters into his office at the embassy and handed out slips of paper. On each was typed a single sentence. Ambassador and Mrs. Morrow announced the engagement of their daughter Anne Spencer Morrow to Colonel Charles A. Lindbergh. That was it. No wedding date, no details, but it was enough for radio broadcasters to break into their regularly scheduled programs with news bulletins, enough to make headlines across the country, enough for thousands of letters and presents to flood the embassy. Some came from family and friends. Most, however, came from folks who simply wanted to rejoice with their hero. Unlike most brides-to-be, recalled Anne, it was I who was congratulated, not he. Reporters swooped down on the couple. Huddled around the embassy gates, they waited, cameras ready. They climbed up trees and onto nearby roofs to photograph the couple in the garden. They bribed servants to share details about the lovebirds, stole letters, talked to unsuspecting friends, and printed distorted anecdotes of the couple's private life. If they ran short of material, they invented stories. Never say anything you wouldn't want shouted from the housetops, Charles instructed Anne. The directive made Anne feel smothered. The lid of caution was clapped down on all my spontaneous expression, she recalled. She wouldn't be able to speak freely to Charles unless they were in the privacy of a plain, a wilderness, or a bedroom. And even in a hotel room, I must be sure that the windows and the transom to the hall were closed to eavesdroppers. It was, she admitted, like putting a string on a wild bird and expecting it to fly. Meanwhile, Betty Morrow had her heart set on a big, traditional Presbyterian wedding and had already begun a lengthy guest list. This included family members as well as business associates, diplomats, and politicians. Charles put his foot down. He wanted a small ceremony with just a select group of family and friends in attendance. And he wanted it held at the Morrows' recently completed New Jersey mansion called Next Day Hill. Betty was shocked. No church? Charles explained he wasn't a churchgoer, therefore getting married in one would be hypocritical. But what about Anne? Asked Betty. She turned to her daughter. Certainly, she wanted to observe Morrow family tradition. Anne remained silent, letting Charles speak for her. Betty had been having problems reconciling herself to this engagement. It wasn't that she didn't like and admire the flyer, but she'd never anticipated having him as her son-in-law. Didn't Anne see how different they were? Hers was the cloistered world of books, writing, and introspection. His was action and adventure. Betty believed solid marriages were based on having things in common. How could Anne know what interests and opinions she shared with Charles? They'd only met four They'd met only 4 times before getting engaged. Charles suggested a compromise. He would allow a Presbyterian minister to perform the ceremony if Charles was allowed to approve all the prayers, verses, and rituals beforehand. Anything he felt compromised his integrity would have to be removed. Betty agreed. They set the wedding date for May 27th, 1929. Another list, another plan. Meticulously, Charles worked out an elaborate charade to fool the press and keep the wedding a secret. Knowing reporters expected a honeymoon by airplane, he decided to take Anne on a boating trip instead. Under a fake name, he ordered a 38-foot cruiser named the Moet to be anchored at an isolated spot off Long Island Sound. While the boat was being readied, Charles had his plane flown to the Rochester, New York airstrip. There he left it, fully serviced and ready to go at a moment's notice. As he'd expected, many of the reporters who'd been swarming the gates of the Morrows' estate in New Jersey hurried to the airstrip, convinced they were about to catch a glimpse of the lone eagle and his bride. The reporters who remained outside Next Day Hill kept watch for signs of a wedding. Florists, caterers, musicians. They felt sure the event would be an elaborate affair. So they paid scant attention. When a handful of people arrived at the Morrow house in the middle of the afternoon. They'd been invited to tea. The guests replied to the reporters' shouted questions. Betty had just telephoned them. They were shown to the large living room, hidden from the street and overlooking the garden. It wasn't until Reverend Dr. William Brown of the Union Theological Seminary arrived that they realized the truth. This wasn't a tea party, this was a wedding ceremony. So insistent on secrecy was Charles that even the guests had been kept in the dark. The double doors leading into the dining room opened. There stood a beaming Dwight Morrow. Beside him, her hand on his arm, was Anne in a simple cream chiffon gown. The family seamstress had secretly run up. Without music, father and daughter moved through the hushed group toward the fireplace where Charles waited in his blue suit. It didn't take long for Reverend Brown to get through the abbreviated wedding service. The groom slipped a gold band onto his bride's finger and awkwardly pecked her cheek. If Anne was disappointed in his lack of ardor, she didn't have time to dwell on it. In an instant, the guests pushed forward to congratulate them. Since Charles didn't have any close friends or family, no one was there from the groom's side except Evangeline. But though there were only a few in attendance, it was a lovely warm group, wrote Anne. She would have liked to stay and bask in her happiness with them. But just minutes after cutting the cake, made weeks earlier and smuggled into the Morrow house during one of Betty's bridge parties, Charles insisted to Anne that they leave. For his plan to work, they needed to get a jump on the press before word of the ceremony leaked out. Disappointed, Anne changed out of her gown, then slipped out the back door with her husband. She crouched down at the wheel. After passing the clutch of reporters, they headed to a little used alley where Charles's car waited. There they donned disguises of hunting caps and glasses, got into the second car, and headed for Long Island. Night had fallen by the time they arrived at an out-of-the-way spot. According to plan, they found the dinghy Charles had arranged to have tied to a tree. In the beam from his flashlight, the newlyweds dragged the boat into the choppy water of Long Island Sound and started rowing. Ahead of them, its lights glowing a warm welcome, bobbed the Moet. Camp Lindbergh. If Anne expected a honeymoon filled with candlelit dinners and long, lazy breakfasts breakfasts in bed. She was disappointed. Charles didn't seem particularly interested in romance. Instead, he spent their first days together learning the ways of his boat. In fact, when he looked back on the trip, that was what he remembered most fondly. I had never before navigated a vessel larger than a rowboat. He wrote 40 years later, but basic principles of navigation for sea and air were similar. It didn't seem to occur to Charles that this time might have been better spent getting to know his wife. He treated the trip more like a stay at Camp Lindbergh than a honeymoon. At Charles's insistence, Anne busied herself arranging all the cans of food on board. It took a while. It took another day to stow them all. When she finished, Charles inspected her work. With his hands on his hips, he said gravely, "The soap powder, the sugar, and the brass polish don't belong together." His comment left Anne feeling impractical and clumsy. Her new husband, she realized, had exacting expectations, strict rules, and specific checklists. And Anne was meant to learn and follow them all. Eager to please, she docilely went along with his demands. "But it takes most of the day," she admitted to her mother. "What with meals and dishes and pans and sink and ice box and stove and floors and decks and the bed to make and the bathroom to clean, etc." The press found them a week later. The couple awoke to the harsh, smirking voice of a reporter calling to them from a nearby vessel. "Is this Colonel Lindbergh's boat?" Now hundreds of reporters surged up the New England coast. A motorboat full of photographers pulled up alongside the Moet. They would leave the honeymooners alone, one called out, if the Lindberghs would come out and pose for a series of pictures. Charles stubbornly and furiously refused. For the rest of the morning and afternoon, the Moet rocked in the wake of the reporters' motorboat as it circled around and around them. Finally, Charles gunned his engine and fled out to sea, dragging the anchor. The couple spent the night in open water, tethered to a fishing bank, fighting to stay in her bunk as the waves rolled and crashed. Waves roiled and dishes crashed. Anne felt hunted.